Our speaker this evening trained as a mechanical engineer, works as a software engineer for Johnson & Johnson in the smallest state of the United States, Rhode Island. Interestingly, this evening we were comparing comparisons of measurements, and those of us in the UK are used to things being measured in the size of Wales or the number of football pitches. Well, apparently in the United States, things are measured in comparison to the size of the state of Rhode Island. Once again, our speaker this evening is going to talk on a subject which is quite dear to my heart: discipline in the British Army. For those that remember, I was a former Provost Marshal Army, but it's a period of the history which is quite fascinating to me, and I don't think I need to say any more other than to say that not only is our speaker this evening a software engineer trained in mechanical engineering, but he also has a raccoon on his desk, which I think he might share with us when I ask Don Hagist to take over. I will leave the stage and leave you with our tonight's speaker, Don Hagist.
All right, thank you very much. I could do this talk in the voice of a raccoon, or I can do it in my normal voice. I think I'm going to go with the normal voice and not let the audience vote on that one. Thank you all very much for coming. I really appreciate it, listening to this talk. This is a talk I especially enjoy, and one reason for that is I study British soldiers who served in America during the American Revolution, or the American War, as the British usually called it during the time period from 1775 to 1783. And I often give talks in the US about just who these soldiers were, what their backgrounds were, where they came from, why they might have joined the army, things like that. And every now and then I use as an example an individual soldier who got lashed at some point during his career. And several times people have come up to me after talks and said, oh, you know, lashing like that, that was really effectively a death sentence. Nobody could survive that. And I've been intrigued by that, and I got to wondering more about that topic, because I'm sure if you've read about the British Army during the 18th century, you've come across quotes like this one. Well, I just have to remind myself how to use the technology here and move to the next page. I'll get it. There we go. So you'll find quotes that say things like this: discipline was harsh. The lash was used to punish offenses, whether trivial or heinous, nor was it applied either lightly or sparingly. All right, so that sounds pretty bad, but you also can find quotes like this one at the bottom that says, the deep attachment most British soldiers felt for their regiments led many of them, prisoners and even deserters, to attempt to return to their regiments. Well, straight away, when I see two quotes like this, they sound very opposed to each other. And so I start to wonder how that can be. How can both of these things be true? Another quote, here's one that was written by somebody who was actually there during the time period. A resident of Boston wrote, "It is shocking to conceive to what degree the soldiers are punished. It is imagined half their deaths arise from it, as it often happens that their ribs are laid quite bare, whereby their kidneys are so affected that they become incurable." I think, oh, that sounds horrible. But then when I start studying careers of individual soldiers, I find people like this one, John Pierce, who enlisted in the 3rd Regiment of Foot on October 8, 1763. And through data that I'll talk about a little later in this talk, I learned that he received 100 lashes on November 17, 1774. And then for a totally different infraction, he received 300 lashes just 4 days later. And he wasn't done yet. About 4 months after that, in March 1775, he received another 300 lashes. And then a particularly interesting thing happened. This man had now gotten 700 lashes within the last 4 months, and then he was drafted to be sent overseas. Drafted during this time period means being pulled from one regiment into another one. And this was a time when there was a big military buildup of British forces in America just before hostilities broke out. Now we could look at this, okay, he was transferred into a regiment going overseas. They wanted to get rid of the man. But the drafting orders were written in such a way that the regiment receiving a draft had right of refusal. So the man had to be fit enough for service that a regiment would accept him into it if he was sent from another regiment. So somehow this guy who had just gotten these 700 lashes over the last 6 months was still fit to be deployed overseas. And even more interestingly, once he got overseas, the 22nd Regiment arrived in Boston at the end of June 1775, and just about 6 weeks later, John Pierce deserted by swimming across the Charles River, which is a swim of about a mile in fairly cold water. So I look and say, he got all these lashes, and yet he was still fit enough to be able to do a swim like that. It just opens up a lot of questions. Was lashing survivable? Clearly it was survivable. At least this one man survived. How could it be survivable? Now, these punishments of 300 and 400 lashes were quite common. Punishments of 1,000 lashes were common. How could this be survivable? What portion of the men who were lashed survived? Was John Pierce a strange anomaly? Was it disabling to most soldiers? And in fact, what proportion of the men were lashed at all? We read a lot about the discipline in the Army and the harshness of the discipline. Did everybody get disciplined, or was it common? Was it unusual? How can we answer all these questions? Well, as our host pointed out, I'm an engineer, so I like to answer questions by doing experiments. Let's try. We can start lashing people and just see how survivable is it. Well, I asked around about this method, and it turns out that experiments are not a very popular approach to answering these questions these days. But instead of experiments, we can use the other approach, which is data from the time period. So the first piece of data I want to get, just to understand what I'm really talking about, is what do we mean by a lash in the first place? Anybody ever give that some real detailed thought? I started looking and said, where can I find descriptions of what these lashes actually were? People talk about it a lot, but what were people in the time period saying? And I found a few descriptions. Francis Gross, who wrote these military antiquities, wrote, "A cat of 9 tails, being a whip with 9 lashes of whipcord, each lashed knotted with 9 knots." All right, that sounds plausible. But then I found another one by a person. Now, he was writing in the 1830s, but he had been involved with the Army several decades before that. So it's still a description. I like to make sure things are really within the same narrow time period if possible, rather than trying to generalize over a broader period. He writes, those writing about whips, he says, "Those which I have seen and used were made of a thick and strong kind of whipcord, and in each lash, 9 in number and generally about 2 feet long, were tied 3 large knots." So that's a similar description, but it's not identical. We have 3 knots instead of 9 knots. All right, small difference. Then we find this is a person who saw a lashing given by the East India Company, which isn't really the Army, but it's similar to the Army in a lot of ways. 1780, he says, "The adjutant brought a small whip made of cotton, which consisted of a number of strands and knotted at the ends, but the knots were all cut off by the adjutant before the drummer took it, which made it not worse than to have been whipped with cotton yarn." So now we're getting a little more variability than I might have expected. Another writer testifying in a court case in 1802. He's a little later than I'd like for a time period, but it'll have to do. "The cat of 9 tails is an instrument of punishment composed of small cords, 9 in number, generally whipped at the ends with threads, which are turned up and twisted round with a bit of thread to prevent their unfolding. The handle is wood." All right, that consists with most of the other descriptions we've seen. And then in looking at some data from a cavalry regiment in the 1770s, I find that they were doing their punishments not with a cat of 9 tails, but with these things called crupper straps or crupper straps. There's a picture of a horse soldier on the screen now, and if you look very closely behind the saddle, there's a strap of leather that goes from the saddle and it wraps around under the horse's tail and goes back up. So that's a crupper strap. And the 3rd Regiment of Horse in the 1770s was lashing their soldiers with these instead of with a cat o' nine tails. It's being like whipped with a leather belt, although a leather belt that's been in close proximity to the backside of a horse for a long time, which might make it a little more humiliating. And one more period description. This one is by Robert Hamilton, who was a surgeon in the British Army in the 1770s and 1780s. And he wrote a book, published it in 1787 in London. His description says, the cords should be small, by which means they will cut cleaner and bruise less. How considerate. Nor should the same cat be long used at one punishment, for by the additional weight of blood with which they are loaded, the severity of each stroke is greatly augmented. So there's some interesting little points of detail in here. One is that he says we don't want the strokes to be overly severe. So keep switching out the lashes so they don't get too heavy with blood. Otherwise, his description is similar to the previous ones. And Robert Hamilton turned out to be a very valuable source for me in learning about this, because he got into the next question I have is, now that we know a little bit about whips and we know that they vary, how were these lashes applied? Did a drummer just go willy-nilly and start slapping the soldier anywhere he wanted to? Well, Robert Hamilton, in his book, has an entire chapter about lashing. Wonderful resource. And if you're clever, you can probably find the book online and read through this in all of its gory detail. He talks in great detail about where on the body to apply lashes and where not to apply them, so that you will administer a punishment without causing long-term damage, how to tie the man to the halberds so that you can lash him properly, what season of year is best for applying lashes in a healthy way, and what kind of weather, how different body types are affected by lashes, and what signs to look for to see that a soldier has had enough, that you should stop punishing him because he might not survive. Let's look at just a few details from this book here. There's an awful lot of material. Again, he's got a good 50 pages on this. When he talks about where to lash, he says very carefully, let the strokes fall on the shoulders, not on the neck. Now, if you think about it, that's some pretty good guidance if you don't want to do terrible damage to the person. To punish so low down as the ribs should be avoided. Let as little new skin as possible be wounded. Now, here he's talking in particular about when soldiers got sentenced to large numbers like 500, 700, 800, 900, 1,000 lashes. Often the lashes were administered in batches of about 250 at a time. So they'd lash the man, 250 lashes, give him some recovery time. And this is what he refers to when he talks about the new skin, and then lash them some more. But be careful not to try to whip that new tender skin. The posteriors, as well as the shoulders, can, without much risk of danger, bear a moderate punishment. So they're very careful, or he's very specifically directing officers to be careful to have their soldiers whipped only in places where they will inflict pain but not damage. Now, whether people were following this guidance or not is another question, of course, but at least he gave us some good information about some of the kind of thinking behind it. When securing a man, the lashes were given by lashing these halberds, these pole things that looked sort of like pole axes that were carried by non-commissioned officers during this era. Lash them into an arrangement, something like what we see in the picture, and make sure that the arms are neither too tight bound nor overstretched. The thighs ought to be considerably tighter bound than the hands, because it is more effectively prevents swinging. So if the man can move around on the halberds, it's a lot more difficult for the drummer to place the lashes carefully, right? If the cords be too loose, room is allowed for swinging, whereby it is out of the power of the punisher to give lashes on the parts directed. So you got to tie them up there pretty snug so that you can aim the lash with care. All right, effective season and weather. This really surprised me to find this kind of information being taken into account. In cold winter weather, the muscle fibers are tense and rigid. Much less danger is to be apprehended from fever. If the prisoner has been long confined, the body will be relaxed and weakened. Autumn is the most sickly season, right? He's talking about England in particular here, but this applies to North America reasonably as well. Never suffer a prisoner to receive his punishment under cover. So you want to be in a ventilated place. And punishment should not be inflicted immediately after a march, because that's when the heart rate will be up, the blood will be flowing more rapidly, and the person will bleed more, which is going to be ultimately more damaging. And he goes on and he writes, some men are more robust and some of a more delicate make. Well, we've all observed this in society, right? Men of red or fair hair with ruddy complexions or a tall, genteel shape will be more affected by a given number of lashes than a man of the hard, dense fiber with 3 times the number. Okay, no surprises here. The way of life, that is the trade they've been bred to, may add to this. Tailors, for instance, are more delicate and tender. All right, he has a lot of other guidance of this nature. It's good and interesting and fun read. And it tells me a lot about the kinds of thinking that went on to make sure that corporal punishment was, in fact, corporal punishment and not capital punishment. So now I want to get in, now I know a little more about what lashes, what whips were like, and that there was some consideration taking into very specifically how to whip somebody in the proper way. So I want some more data now. I want to know something about how many men in a regiment might actually be punished, how many survived, and what became of them. Well, I've been very fortunate through a lot of digging and a lot of good mischance in my research journey to find a number of punishment books. These are regimental records. They record the name of a soldier, the date on which a trial was held, the crime he committed, the sentence that was passed down by a regimental court-martial. And more important than just the sentence, they record the extent that the sentence was actually inflicted, because, of course, sometimes punishments were pardoned or sentences were remitted for other reasons. These punishment records for this time period are very, very rare. It's taken me something like 40 years of research to find a grand total of 8 of them that apply to infantry in the British Army during the 1770s and the 1780s. This includes one for a fencible regiment. That's a picture right here is for a Scottish fencible regiment, which existed for only a 4-year period in the end of the 1770s and early 1780s. For this study, I used 5 of these punishment books. Only 5 because it's really, really exhaustive. It's very tedious to go through this data and do some of the work that we'll see as I go forward here and get the kind of information we want in it to really understand what we're looking at. I used the punishment books from the 3rd, 36th, 44th, 67th, and 68th regiments of foot. These are survived in 2 different archives. And each one of them covers only a few-year time period, so they're not enormously comprehensive, but they're sufficient for the kind of purposes we're using here. This is a picture from the punishment book of the 44th Regiment of Foot in the Public Archive of Canada. And these books, they tell us how many men were actually tried, how many of those who were tried actually were sentenced, because some men, of course, are found innocent by courts. And they tell us to what extent the sentence was actually carried out, which is a great thing. So here in the picture, if you can see it there's a man who was sentenced to 500 lashes, but it says that 125 were remitted. So he didn't receive 500 lashes, even though that was the sentence. They don't tell us what became of the man after they were punished. And they also don't tell us another really important thing, how many men were not tried. Because I would like to know proportions. How likely was a given man to be tried? One of the really interesting pieces of information I found in these is about remitted sentences, where sentences were not fully administered. So for regimental trials, this is all regimental court data as opposed to brigade or general court martials. Typical sentences were 100 to 500 lashes. but they were not all always administered. For a few different reasons, punishments could be stopped by the surgeon, or they could be forgiven just as an act of mercy by the commanding officer of the regiment, extenuating circumstances in the trial, whatever reason. The punishment books do tell us that sentences were partially remitted. They don't tell us the reason for it. We can only have to guess at that. And the other thing that really jumped out when I looked in these punishment books was the surprising number of repeat offenders. The whole point of these corporal punishments was to discourage men, not only individuals from repeating their crimes or getting into trouble again, but also to discourage others from getting in trouble. But I found that in these 5 punishment books, we had a total of 1,372 trials, but only 926 individual soldiers being tried. So that's a very high number of repeat offenses. In fact, if you were Terence Quigley in the 44th Regiment of Foot between 1779 and 1784, you could have a whole page of a punishment book dedicated just to you. Here he is. He's got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8 times over a 4-year period. He's getting tried and he's getting sentenced. And for every single one, if we look way over on the right in the column that says sentence, he's getting lashed every single time, 100, 210, 300, 100, 150, on and on it goes. So what this makes me think of is back when we were all in grade school, we had lots of friends, and there was always some small portion of the kids in any given class that were in trouble all the time, right? And then there were some who would get in trouble maybe once in their whole school career. But the vast majority, I hope, depending on where you went to school, of course, never got in trouble at all. And that's what I'm starting to see when I look more carefully at this data. We have a lot of repeat offenders. And if we look only at the total numbers of trials and not this additional level of granularity, we can skew our impression of what we're seeing. So now I want to know the proportion. I know I've got a whole lot of crimes, a whole lot of individual soldiers. I know a lot about the punishments. I want to know something about how that fits into the more general population. So for that, we turn to muster rolls. Anybody who's done research in this time period may be familiar with these. They are kept quarterly or semi-annually during the 1770s, 1780s. They record the name of each man in the regiment, when he joined, when he left the regiment for whatever one of these D reasons, discharged, died, deserted, or drafted. So this is good. I can look at the muster rolls from these regiments and find out all the men who served in them, except that unfortunately, there are some gaps. For whatever reason, the rolls are not as complete as I'd like them to be. So I have to use some clever estimates. Fortunately, I've worked a lot with muster rolls. I have a pretty good understanding of what was going on with these regiments and how men moved through them. So when I have a gap of 6 months or a year in the rolls, I can usually make a reasonable estimate of what might have been going on in between. But it's really important to recognize that that makes all of the data I'm going to show going forward a little bit imprecise. Unfortunately, all we can do is estimate, which is better than not knowing anything at all, of course, but it's not exact. And here's what I come up with. I went through, for these 4 regiments, each one has, or 5 regiments rather, each one has a punishment book that spans a period of between 3 and 6 years. There's an awful lot of numbers on here, but the first one to look at is there's a estimated total of 4,989 men served in these regiments across this whole time period. Almost 1,000 men per regiment. Now, regiments, of course, weren't that big, but men came in and men went out. So it ends up being a total of close to 5,000. There were 1,372 trials, 926 individuals tried. And of those 926 men who stood trial, 480 of them were actually lashed. And again, as we've seen, some more than once, 480 individual men actually lashed, which works out to about 10% of the total number of soldiers who were in those regiments. About 18.5%, again, an estimate from the total number of men being imprecise. That's about 1/6 of all of the men who served, got punished. So that gives me a sense, just a general sense of how likely was a soldier to get punished. Well, about 1 in 6 men actually end up being put on trial. And then about 1 in 10 men actually end up getting lashed at some point during their careers. You can see the percentages vary. In the 3rd Regiment of Foot, quite a high proportion was put on trial. Whereas in the 44th Regiment of Foot, a low number was put on trial. Now, 4 of these regiments were in Ireland at this time, and they were doing a lot of recruiting. Because the American War was starting up, men who were fit for overseas service were being drafted into regiments being deployed overseas, leaving the 3rd, 36th, 67th, 68th Regiment depleted, and then they have to do a lot of recruiting. Quite possibly, this is the reason why they have higher numbers of trials and punishments, because they're very actively recruiting. They're all 4 of them in Ireland at this time. And if you read newspaper accounts and other period sources of the time, discipline problems among Irish recruits were arguably somewhat higher than among other recruits. That may have contributed to some of the data. And this is where the problem of looking, and I say, okay, I've got 5,000 men, I've got all these, 1,372 trials, but there are some biases in the data that I have to consider. I can't say for sure that if we had a bigger data set that these numbers would hold. But this is what we've got right now, so this is what I'm going with, right? And the next thing I want to know about these men is what happened to them? All these guys who got lashed, did they all die? Did they all walk away healthy? What happened? Well, sadly, I can't be sure because of these infernal gaps in the muster rolls. But what I can see is that of the 480 soldiers who got lashed, at least half of them just continued serving in their regiment for at least a year after that, which tells me that they were probably reasonably healthy. 20 more of them were drafted into other regiments, which tells me that they were very healthy. 23 of them were discharged soon after they were lashed. Now, that could mean that their health was destroyed by the lashings, or it could also be that they were just seen as discipline problems and the Army didn't want them anymore, so they punished them and then discharged them because they just weren't worth having around. Again, the numbers tell us what, but they don't tell us why, and we don't want to make too many assumptions. 53 of the men, 10% of them, a little over 10%, deserted within a year after they were lashed. No surprise there, right? A grand total of only 3 of them died within a year after being lashed. The muster rolls tell us the date of death, but the muster rolls do not tell us the cause of death. So we have no idea why these men died. It's possible that they got horrible infections from the lashing and died of them. It's also possible that they were trying to desert and got shot by a sentry. We can't guess that the cause of death was the lashing. What we can see from this is it was extremely rare for a man to die soon after he got lashed, which is kind of what should happen with corporal punishment. About 50 of the men disappear from the muster rolls, and we don't have no reason is stated. That's one unfortunate thing about the muster rolls. They don't always tell us all we want. And because of the gaps in the rolls, there are still 84 about whom I just don't know what became of them at all. So again, this data isn't all that precise. I had a long talk about some of this information with my colleague, Andrew Cormack, who I believe is on the call, and is one of, I think, only he and I are perhaps the only 2 people on the planet who really have looked deeply into the British Army pension system during the 18th century. And something that intrigued me about this, looking at all this data, was at least 31 of these soldiers who got lashed during their careers at some point ended up getting pensions later on after long and good service. So having 1 or 2 regimental court-martial trials under your belt and some punishments didn't necessarily guarantee that you could not get an Army pension eventually. An important note about the desertion: 50 men deserted after they were punished. Well, guess what? That's smaller than the number of men who deserted from these regiments during this time period who did not get punished. So there was more desertion among the men who didn't get punished than among the men who did, which just tells me that we can't say that there's a correlation between punishment and desertion. All right. Let's get into some more interesting things if I can figure out how to advance the slide, because I lost my cursor. Here we go. We're almost done here, so hang in there. Careers of some last soldiers. I'm going to give only 2 examples. A lot of these soldiers I went through and I was able to compile some details about their careers, and I could spend the entire rest of the day showing you examples, but it would get tiresome, so I'll just look at 2. First one is William Anderson of the 3rd Regiment of Foot. In August 1774, he was charged by a regimental court for absenting himself from the regiment. Pretty common type of crime, 200 lashes and a month in the black hole. Of course, you all know the black hole is not a cosmological phenomenon characterized by intensely high gravity. It's a solitary confinement cell with no light. 1 month later, he was tried again for being out of the barracks until 9:30 p.m., 50 lashes. 1 month later, he was tried again for being absent for a whole day, selling his necessaries, some of his clothing, and sconcing a public house, which means he got food and drink and then left without paying his bill. For that, he got 500 lashes. And 1 month later, he is drunk, absent, abusing an inhabitant. For this, he got punished differently. Rather than lashing, because clearly lashing just wasn't doing the job for him, he had his coat turned, he was chained to a bombshell for 2 months, and he was confined to the barracks. And a few months later, he was out of barracks again. He unchained him from the bombshell. You just can't contain this guy. He lost his necessaries this time, and they chained him right back to that bombshell. Same month, he was drafted into another regiment being sent to fight in the war in America. How about that? And the interesting thing here is after he goes overseas to serve in the war in America, he serves for the entire 8 years, including becoming a prisoner of war at the Siege of Yorktown, where then he stayed a prisoner for about 1.5 years. And when the prisoners were repatriated at the end of the war, he went back, rejoined his regiment in New York, and then he was discharged in October of 1783 and given a land grant in Nova Scotia. Now, we don't have any punishment records for the 23rd Regiment of Foot while they were in America. Again, this punishment data is exceedingly rare. And just like I'm sure all of you researchers have run into, when we have data that's exceedingly rare, we tend to have it for the things that we need it for the least and not for the things we want it for the most. So I have no idea whether this guy ran into any trouble in America or not, but we don't have any record that he did. Owen Dowd, 44th Regiment of Foot, enlisted on March 12, 1775. Now, we don't know much of anything about his career. We have no details until January of 1779 when he was tried for selling his necessaries and he got 200 lashes. And a few months later, he sold his necessaries again and got another 100 lashes. And in that November, making away with his necessaries. They got to stop giving this guy clothing because you know what he's going to do with it, right? It's another 300 lashes. And then his commanding officer wrote to the adjutant general and said, I request you'll be so good as to ask the commander-in-chief permission for me to discharge 2 men, including him, whose vices render them unfit for the land service, but they might be useful in the Navy. And sure enough, he was pardoned and discharged to serve on board a man of war soon after that. Now, if somebody really wants to, they can go to the ADM 36 collection at the National Archives and look in the muster books for men of war and try to find which ship he went on to and what happened to him after that. I just don't have the time for that. But we see here again, sometimes these men who were discharged after being lashed, it wasn't because they were no longer healthy enough to serve. It was because the Army just did not want them anymore. So if you remember only a few things from this talk, odds are you will remember only a few things from this talk. These are the things I would like you to remember. First is that the real data on this topic is pretty scarce. you'll find perhaps a lot of writing about it, but not much real data. But from the data we have, we can deduce, I'm going to say, because remember we have to make some estimates in our data, we can conclude that 15 to 25% of the soldiers in a given regiment are liable to be put on a regimental, tried by a regimental court at some point during their careers. And of those, about 10% are liable to actually get lashed for their crimes. And of those who were lashed, almost all of them survived and continued to serve in the Army at least for a while. So again, corporal punishment, just as we might expect, is corporal punishment, not a death sentence, as some people seem to think. And just to drive that point home, our friend Robert Hamilton wrote in his book, "The surgeon's business at punishments is to prevent any danger to the life of the patient." So all these punishments are being monitored by the surgeon to make sure that you don't kill the man when you're lashing him. That's all I have right now. I hope you'll put questions in the chat. I am going to give a quick plug for a book I have. If you want to know more about this data on the lashings and the trials and what Robert Hamilton said, I've included a lot of it in my book about British soldiers during the American War. And in fact, if you want to know in general about careers of British soldiers in America during this time period, with all modesty aside, I will tell you this is the best source you're going to find for it. You can get the book through major retailers. You can order it online. If you want a signed copy, you can get one through the URL below. If you like these little vignettes about British soldiers and their careers, I have a blog. If you want to contact me directly, I have an email address that's up here. And one of the things I do is I edit a publication called the Journal of the American Revolution, which is an online magazine that's absolutely free to subscribe to. Highly encouraged. And with that, I thank you all very much.
Thank you, Don. I found that fascinating. I think we got two for the price of one there. Not only did we find out more about your subject, but we also got a masterclass in how to carry out data research. I noticed we've got some real experts in the audience. Zach's in here, so I'm hoping Zach's going to put a few questions up there for us. You mentioned a number of times about the drummer, suggesting that it was always the drummer that applied the lashes. But of course, those of us that know very little about the subject would say that we're familiar with the phrase, "You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours," suggesting that other people might apply the lashes, and if we do it kindly, when it comes to your turn to apply it to my back. Are you familiar with that phrase, and can you talk more about who actually does apply the lashes?
Well, I'm familiar with the phrase. I've never heard it associated with lashing in the Army before. I will say that. I am also familiar with the phrase, "Don't let the cat out of the bag." And some people will say that that is related to military punishments, and it's not. That's an incorrect etymology. That phrase has to do with the guys selling piglets, but putting a cat in the bag instead of the pig and handing it off. You know, don't reveal the deception, is don't let the cat out of the bag. Let's get back to drummers. As far as we know, the punishments were administered by drummers during the time period. Quite a lot of military texts refer to this specifically, and sometimes the sentence of a general court-martial will say very explicitly that the lashes are to be administered by the drummers of the regiment, or we find this in orderly books as well. So we're pretty sure that they were always administered by the drummers, even though we don't have records that show for sure. In general, during this time period, a regiment of infantry has 10 drummers, one for each of 10 companies. For those of you who study the American War, I hear you saying, what about when, well, let's leave that aside for a moment. 10 drummers. So if there's and the drummers rotate through the number of lashes they give. So we can expect that each drummer is going to administer about 25 lashes before handing off the cat or using a fresh new one for the next drummer. Drummers varied in age a great deal. A man could start, or a boy could start carrying the drum at the age as young as 12 if he was fit enough to do so. It's a bulky instrument, so he has to be grown enough. Again, military writers in this time period talk about this a lot. So we expect some of the drummers in a regiment to be 12, 13, 14 years old, but there are also a large number of drummers who serve their entire military career, sometimes as much as 30 or 40 years, as drummers. So we can't just characterize all the drummers in a regiment as being boys, and nor can we characterize them all as being adults. It looks to be about half and half. There's not a single regiment for which I have really clear data for all of the drummers at any given time. For most regiments that I've studied, I can find age data for about half of the drummers, and that ends up being a pretty good half and half. Some are teenagers and some are well into adulthood. We don't know details like, did only the adult drummers administer the lashes? Or did every single drummer, was part of them given by a 12-year-old and part by a 35-year-old? We just don't have that level of detail in any sources that I'm aware of. So to conclude, yes, the drummers give the lashes, maybe because they've got strong arms. and some drummers are young, but certainly not all of them are young.
Yeah, as Zach has pointed out, we don't have Eamon O'Keefe in the audience this evening, but Eamon did his thesis on army musicians of this period, and Zach tells me that his research indicated that the majority of drummers were at least in their very late teens.
Yes,
that's interesting.
That correlates pretty well with mine as well.
Roberts asked who in the regiment was responsible for carrying and maintaining the lash.
That's a great question, and I wish we knew that level of information, but we don't. We know that the drummers are doing the lashing, but does that mean that the drummers actually each had their own lash or not? We just don't know. I don't know things. After reading all those descriptions of lashes, particularly the surgeon who said, make sure they don't get too heavy with blood. That makes me wonder, did you go out and buy new batches of lashes regularly, or did you wash them off? How long did a lash last? Just don't know. I can say I've gone through a number of regimental account books in the from the agency Cox and Mayer in the Lloyd's Bank archives. And I can't say that I found a single entry talking about the purchase of lashes during the 1770s and 1780s, which is the narrow time period that I study. So I just don't know how often lashes were purchased, how many a regiment had, who carried them and maintained them. I wish we knew.
Okay, thank you. We've got a number of Andrews in the audience today, so I don't know which Andrew this is. Thank you for your interesting talk, Don. Can you comment on the economic circumstances of the regiments? For example, are the 44th receiving their wages at the time when that soldier decided to sell his uniform several times?
That's an interesting question. And again, it gets to one of these things where we just don't have enough detail. There are a few regiments for which we have some nice, real accurate pay books that cover some slice of time. And then we've got a few for which we have these punishment books that cover a nice slice of time. But guess what we don't have is two things for the same regiment at the same time. I don't have any reason to doubt that the soldiers in the 44th Foot were receiving their pay at a reasonably normal intervals. This punishment book covers a period in 1779 when they were stationed in New York during the American War. They were part of a garrison. And then a time when they were sent from there to Canada, where they again served in garrisons. So there's no reason to doubt that the regiment in general was receiving pay at a rate that they should have been. Also, the punishment book doesn't seem to show any increases in the frequency of particular kinds of crimes at certain time periods. Although that's something I haven't looked at the data and arranged it in that way. I tend to look soldier by soldier rather than time period. But I don't recall seeing any increase like, oh, during this 6-month period, a lot of soldiers were selling the necessaries. And then during that period, none of them were. So I really think that if we look carefully at the trial proceedings we have for general trials and the descriptions of crimes, the one phrase, modern phrase that always comes into play is alcohol was a factor. So I'm thinking that most of these guys who were selling their things just had real problems, and it wasn't not getting paid, but rather they just wanted more booze than they could afford.
Thank you. As a modern day provost marshal, I can tell you that problem existed into the 20th and 21st century.
Yeah.
And actually, your explanation or talk about the army on campaign and in garrison leads nicely into Zach's question, which is, how much variation did you find in disciplinary practices between when the army was on campaign versus when it was in cantonments?
This is an excellent question, and the general answer is less on campaign than when in cantonments. Unfortunately, as I said, again, this is the narrowness of the data problem. Of these 5 punishment books I've looked through in detail so far, 4 of them were exclusively in cantonments or peaceful encampments. So they're in Ireland, they're moving from place to place, they're recruiting, but they're effectively in cantonments, even if they're in camps, they're not on campaign. And for the 44th, just for this period from 1779 through 1784 or 5, I think it is, they were not really on campaign for any of that time. We have another punishment book from a contingent formed by a portion of the 18th and a portion of the 65th Regiment of Foot while they were in Boston in 1774 and 1775, not on campaign. There's the book I mentioned from one of the Scottish Fencible regiments during the American War, but not on campaign. And there's one from the 1st Regiment of Foot Guards in the Guards archives that I have photographs of, but I haven't gone through the data yet. But again, they're in London, they're not on campaign. I have started compiling material from regimental orderly books that survive from regiments when they are on campaign. Those are also pretty rare, but I'm starting to get enough data to look at the frequency of courts on campaign versus in garrison. I don't have it compiled yet, but it does look like there's far fewer regimental trials when you're on campaign. As far as defining what I mean by far fewer, I can't say yet.
Yeah, sure.
Great question.
Roberts asked, what was the most common offence a soldier was lashed for, and what offence received the most lashes?
Oh boy, I have to think about this for a second. I presented information only from regimental trials. There are also general court-martials, and for general court-martials, bigger crimes, bigger punishments. So the most lashes we see are in the 1,000 to 2,000 range, and those are for desertion. You desert, you get caught, you either get executed or you get lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of lashes. So that's the biggest one. Among the regimental trials, I'd have to think about it because I right offhand, I can't say I know the most common one, but most of them have to do with behavioral things associated with alcohol. So it's riotous behavior, drunkenness on duty, drunkenness off duty, drunkenness on and off duty, or things that seem to be related to drunkenness. When they talk about mutinous behavior, and then you see trial records, that usually just means they were highly disobedient. And I'm trying to think of the right kinds of terminology, from insolence toward their officers, those sorts of things.
Okay. Mark's asked, Well, what about alternative punishments? In my own work on the 8th, 12th, 17th, and 35th Regiments of Foot, I found a variety of punishments, most frequently demotion in rank, but sometimes more obscure dramas outside the court records, like taking family members off the roll of the regiment or depriving offenders of employment. Can you speculate on how this might have had an impact on flogging statistics?
I can. I don't have the exact numbers right off the top of my head. I did talk about this in the book Noble Volunteers. But I did look at this, and in all these trials, I had 1,372 trials, and the vast majority of them, the punishment was lashing. So many that I didn't even talk about anything else today. But there were some where the punishment wasn't lashing. That was most common for non-commissioned officers, who were in fact the only ones who could be demoted in rank, because private soldier, that was it for rank, you know. So it was very common for non-commissioned officers to get demoted in rank instead of any other kind of punishment. Very common. You saw a few cases that I showed where rather than being punished by lashing, people were changed to a bombshell, have their coat turned, a few other things. But we're talking, I think, in this data I showed, I did the numbers and I don't have them off the top of my head, but it was fewer than 10% of the cases where men were convicted of crimes was the punishment something other than lashes for the private soldiers. So there were a few alternative punishments, and occasionally if somebody had incurred a debt or stolen money, the punishment was simply to pay it back. But almost always, again, for these 5 punishment books in this time period, it was lashes. I'd love to see this other data and more about the specific time periods and places and circumstances.
Yes, you mentioned that the data that you looked at were from infantry regiments of foot, but Zach's asked, have you had the opportunity to compare this data with cavalry regiments to see if there is a different set of crimes prioritized or different punishment practices?
I'm glad you framed the question the way you did, because in this parcel of data that has 4 of the infantry punishment books, there's also half a dozen cavalry punishment books. But you said, have I had the opportunity to compare it? And the answer is no. I haven't had the opportunity to do that yet. Again, lots and lots and lots of data. Not my day job, sadly, but if anybody here wants to pay me to do this, I will prioritize it. But yeah, so far I haven't had the opportunity to look at this. And my focus has always been the soldiers who served in America during the war, and they were almost all infantry. So that tends to be why I'm infantry focused. But I'd love to really study the cavalry data too. And actually, if anybody here wants this data to do analysis on themselves, just send me an email. I will happily share the information. It's not like it's data that I own or anything. And I'd love to see more people do more work with it.
Yeah.
It's more agonizingly time-consuming, tedious work with it. Yeah.
It's so annoying that we have to earn a living, that we can't spend all of our time researching this data.
Well, again, if any of you can give me a grant, I would.
I highly recommend retirement, Don. It's really good.
I've heard this said, yeah. My retirement age and my credit rating are approaching each other from opposite directions right now.
Christopher has asked, were there significant differences in the number of punishments carried out among the 3 main branches of the army?
I couldn't say, because I looked only at infantry data. I would love to have an answer to that one too, but I have not found any punishment data for artillery at all. And I have this data from cavalry regiments. They were all in Ireland during the period I haven't looked at it. Again, I've also got this fencible regiment that I haven't really examined the punishment book yet, and foot guards. So yeah, there's a lot more data that we could look at, but I just haven't gotten to it yet.
Yeah, Zach's reminded us that in a previous talk, he talked about the phenomenon of the company court-martial, that the informal punishments, if you like, where the punishments were more moral in nature. That tier of court did not have any formal legal basis, so could not flog. Did you ever come across evidence of these company court martials in your research?
I think the answer is I've come across occasional anecdotal evidence. I haven't tried to compile it, and I quite frankly don't think I've come across enough to have a useful compilation. You know, I could say, well, I know it happened some, but not enough to speak to it in a good, solid statistical way.
Fine, thank you. That's fine. Andrew, again, some of your examples showed the same man received different sentences for the same offence. Do you get any sense of a typical punishment for particular offences, or did a lot depend on the circumstances of the case or the need to make an example, for instance?
This is a way that I haven't looked at the data to line up all the crimes and all the punishments and try to see, okay, was it almost always this amount for this kind of crime? I am certain from general court-martial information that there's unwritten circumstances that factor into these things. I do see trends with the repeat offenders where the number of lashes sometimes goes up with each repeated offense, but not necessarily. Unfortunately, again, we don't have the actual proceedings of the trial, and we don't know anything about, even for the general courts where we do have the trial proceedings, we don't know anything about the deliberations by the officers. I find general courts where a man is tried for desertion, and all the evidence looks like, yeah, there's no doubt whatsoever that he deserted, and he's found innocent. And then another man where it looks entirely circumstantial and he probably has a great excuse, and then he gets sentenced to death. And I say there must be something more that they know about the character of this soldier and his career that's not here in the records, that influences these wild differences in the outcomes of what would appear to be similar trials.
Oh, there's an easy answer to that, Don. As my wife will tell you, if people like you, you get away with a lot.
Well, sure. Yeah, we know nothing about the demeanor of the person when they're being put on trial, and that could be an enormous factor in the decision of the court.
Well, I think we have got to the end of the questions. Tomorrow I will send you the chat, but people have found it fascinating, really interesting. And as I said, not only is the subject interesting, but your approach to the scientific approach you've taken is fascinating.
I appreciate that.
And it just goes to show how important it is not only to take the data, but to interrogate it in a systematic and intelligent manner. And that's clearly what you've done. And as I said, I will send you, I will send you the chat tomorrow, but on behalf of the Society and on behalf of the audience this evening, thank you very much indeed for giving up your time this evening, Don.
No, thank you for the opportunity.
Great. And hopefully we will hear from you again soon.
All right.
Thank you. We do have a talk next month, people, but I as yet have not set a date. So please look out for the announcements. Oh, and our speaker has left. So on that note, I will close down the session. And thank you, everybody, for attending this evening. Good night.